Hi, and welcome to a new episode of Interpreting India. From geopolitical complexities to economic uncertainties, India faces critical challenges in its quest for a more prominent role on the world stage. This season, we at Carnegie India continue to bring voices from India and around the world to examine the role of technology, economy, and international security in shaping India's future. In today's episode, we tackle one of the most pervasive challenges in contemporary tech discourse, separating genuine AI capabilities from exaggerated claims and outright myths. The AI landscape is dominated by two extreme narratives. On the one side, we have breathless proclamations that AI will revolutionize every aspect of human life within years, will cure diseases, eliminate poverty, and usher in an age of unprecedented prosperity. On the other side, we have apocalyptic warnings that AI poses an existential threat to humanity, will steal millions of jobs overnight, and could spiral into uncontrollable superintelligence. In the midst of this polarized discourse, we lose a more nuanced understanding of what AI can and cannot actually do, how it's being deployed in the real world, and what realistic expectations we should have for its development. I'm Nidhi Singh, Senior Research Analyst and Program Manager at Carnegie India, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Sayash Kapoor. Sayash is a Senior Fellow at Mozilla, a Lawrence S. Rockefeller Fellow in the Princeton University Center for Human Values, and a Computer Science PhD candidate at Princeton University Center for Information Technology Policy. He is a co-author of AI Snake Oil, and his newsletter by the same name is read by over 50,000 subscribers, including me. Along with his co-author, Arvind Narayanan, Sayash has been recognized as one of Time's 100 most influential people in AI. Sayash, welcome to Interpreting India. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So thank you so much for making the time to speak to us today. I want to start at the very beginning of your journey into this space. So just tell us the backstory. What prompted you and your co-author to write AI Snake Oil and focus on debunking AI myths?
Well, for me, the story of how I came about or how I came to this project goes back to the first research project I did in my PhD. So back in 2021, I joined the CS program at Princeton. And together with Arvind, my advisor, we started to look at the question of how can machine learning models predict outcomes about the future? How well can they do that? In what domains should and shouldn't we expect them to do well? And we found that across this whole range of domains, especially when we're predicting social outcomes, that is, outcomes about people, AI systems can barely do better than random or barely do better than decades-old regression methods, except for this one field, which was predicting civil wars. So, if you can indeed predict civil wars, that would be amazing. We would be able to prevent conflict, perhaps prioritize resources. And there had been this whole spate of papers, about half a dozen of them, that claimed that machine learning methods could outperform these older statistical methods that use regression. And so we were pretty excited. Back then, I remember talking to Arvind about sort of trying to figure out the secret sauce of what makes machine learning models better than these older methods. Perhaps we could learn some things from civil war prediction and apply them to these other domains where machine learning did not do well. And so we dove in. But unfortunately, what we found was that this entire line of research was riddled with errors. In particular, back in 2021, every single paper that had claimed that machine learning models outperform these logistic regression models, every single one of them had errors. And further, when we corrected these errors, it turned out that the machine learning models actually did not outperform these older methods at all. So that was this very interesting turning point where before doing this project, I had the opinion that perhaps we can use AI for these difficult prediction tasks. Perhaps there's something we can learn from machine learning methods. After doing this, I was quite skeptical. And then one of our colleagues, Matt Salganik, he's a sociologist at Princeton, he encouraged us to try to sort of broaden the scope of this work, to try to figure out if the issues that we'd found in civil war prediction are limited to this one field or if they apply to a broader set of fields. And so we did that. And I think we ended up finding that the same errors that we'd uncovered affected hundreds of papers across a dozen different scientific fields. In each case, it turned out that this field was using machine learning in the wrong ways. And, these fields were independently rediscovering these errors. So that made me much more skeptical about the results that I saw coming out from machine learning for science. And so that was sort of my introduction to this area, or the first research that I did that contributed to the book. I think Arvind came at it slightly earlier. So he had an employee of an algorithmic hiring company reach out to him. So algorithmic hiring companies are companies that sort of try to automate the process of job interviews. Let's say you give an interview in front of an AI, it rates you based on whether you're predicted to do well at the job you're applying to. And an employee at one of these companies reached out to Arvind saying that what their company is selling is essentially snake oil, that their tools don't work. And this made Arvind really skeptical about the use of AI for prediction. And I think he gave this talk at MIT that was titled How to Detect AI Snake Oil. That really went viral. And so I think that sort of really formed the framework for his thinking on the topic as well. And I think over the last sort of 4 years or so, we've been doing a lot of research together that informed what went into the book.
I think that's really fascinating context to see. I think one of you coming from a background on trying to predict civil war, and another person coming from a background on hiring algorithms and predictive use of AI, and sort of converging at this particular intersection. It's a fascinating book. It's a great piece of research. Honestly, I've really enjoyed reading it. So it's very interesting to hear about how you came about sort of to this context. But I think more than that, I can see that while this is the books are like this, and academic literature has now sort of pivoted where it's now starting to look into what the limitations of AI are. That's not what the mainstream media reporting on this looks like. So if you look at any headlines right now, it's all about how AI is taking over all of the jobs and it's running amok. But in your research, you actually talk about how AI adoption in the real world, in like real world consequences, is actually a little slower and it's a lot messier than people think it is. So it's unlikely that we're all going to wake up tomorrow morning and then all of us will be laid off and AI will have taken over all of our jobs. Can you tell me a little bit about what is this gap between what the media reporting looks like and what the academic discourse around AI is?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think like part of it is the gap between focusing on the technology itself versus focusing on how technology impacts the world. So I think within the tech community and specifically within the AI community, there is correctly a lot of focus on improving the capabilities of AI systems. But there isn't a corresponding focus on what the bottlenecks across these different domains where AI might be adopted are. And so what this means is like AI researchers are often very good at coming up with ideas for improving AI systems. But their thinking around how these systems are then adopted within various real world concepts is of course not at the same level. Unfortunately, I think especially when we're talking about media reporting on AI, we tend to take AI experts at face value, not just within their domain of expertise where we should take them at face value, but rather also in like the broader impacts, the broader societal impacts of AI. I was reminded of this when I read Dario Amodei's recent interview about mass joblessness in white-collar work. I was reminded of this incident back in 2016 when Nobel laureate Geoffrey Hinton said that if you're a radiologist today, you might not have a job in 5 years. I think he said something to the lines of, we should stop training radiologists now because it's completely obvious deep learning will do better than radiologists in the next 5 years. So this was in 2016. In 2022, we suffered a worldwide shortage of radiologists. And so this sort of highlights the gap between AI experts and their understanding of what actually it is that people do in their day-to-day work. This is not to question the fact that, AI it genuinely has improved at many tasks that a radiologist might do. But what that has meant is that like radiologists have sort of by and large adopted AI systems as one part of the decision-making process. It hasn't really meant that, we suddenly have no need for radiologists anymore. And I expect this type of trend will sort of continue to show up over and over, that AI experts will predict that certain jobs can be automated away, but it might in the real world mean that these jobs are only being augmented, that the nature of the jobs changes, of course, with AI, but these jobs don't go away. Of course, like within all of this, there's also some categories of jobs that I do think will be impacted quite heavily. So, for instance, we are already beginning to see a reduction in the demand for occupations like translation, where, had we not had these capable AI systems, there would have been a lot more demand for translators as opposed to the current demand right now. And for many other tasks as well, I expect we'll see these changes to the nature of the job market in like the next sort of coming years. But I don't think that'll lead to this mass sudden phenomenon where white collar workers are out of work.
Yeah, I think there's some conversation to be had about how so much of this particular, like even the policy discourse and the regulation discourse around this goes on to a speculative end of what it will look like, that we miss a lot of what's happening right now. So I do think that the conversation that we were at some point having, which I think has now sort of fallen out of mainstream discourse, on the concerns around surveillance and bias and labor exploitation, has all fallen to the wayside. And now everybody's just talking about artificial general intelligence and what the extinction risk of AI is. But of course, the other factors that come in, like surveillance, bias, how this will change the labor market, not in such massive ways, but actually in smaller ways, are concerns that are probably more time sensitive and more relevant to us right now. But there's a core misalignment on what people want to think about and talk about. Why do you think that is? Like, why is all of this concern on just speculative outcomes that could happen, and we're not really talking about what matters right now?
I think some of it does come down to the fact that we are sort of treating AI experts as the de facto people who should be, whose expertise we should be relying on, especially as the technology is advancing so quickly, and like these capabilities are advancing so quickly. And I think that is like fair. Like to some extent, we should be relying on AI experts to understand what the state of the technology is and where it is going. At the same time, as you said, I don't think that sort of takes away from concerns around surveillance or labor displacement and so on. In the US, at least, I have seen that, concerns around existential risks, for instance, haven't really sort of put these other concerns, these more time sensitive or short term concerns, on the wayside. In fact, if anything, I think it has led to more of a conversation also around the labor impacts or around the surveillance impacts. But at the same time, I think like much of the reason why we are not having this conversation to the extent that we might otherwise have is because we are not relying on domain experts. We're not relying on economists' understanding of what the labor market will look like. I do think that is starting to change, though. I think if we look at like AI policy back in 2023 versus today, there has been more of a concern about the labor issues of AI. There's more conversation, at least in the US, about these other much more mundane aspects of AI. We've even started to see more concerns around the climate impacts as well as the energy costs of AI systems. These are all conversations that were much more nascent a couple of years ago.
No, that's actually quite interesting. And I guess it's also in line with how a lot of these emerging technologies work. I think that there's so much focus on getting caught up on what the technology does and how it's going to work, that all of the fake focus just goes on the technical experts, and it doesn't get the sort of interdisciplinary approach that it really deserves, because that takes a lot more time, and it takes time to build up that sort of capacity and come together and discuss what the holistic way to approach a problem is. So I guess in that sense, it does follow what happens with a lot of emerging technologies in that sense. But it's good to hear that that focus is now shifting, and then you're getting a broader multidisciplinary approach to looking at these issues. So now I think it was great to hear about this. I'm going to get to the hype around the AI discourse. So as I talked about before in the introduction as well, AI conversations are usually there are two ends of the spectrum. And then one end of the spectrum is where everybody has breathless hype about what AI is going to do. And the other end of the spectrum is just apocalyptic doom. And in the middle of all of this, you have work that's coming up called AI as normal technology, which I thought was a very interesting topic. As I understand, you published this essay and you plan to have a series of essays, and this will all inform the next piece of work that you're working on. So what does it mean to treat AI as normal technology? And what is this perspective that you're trying to bring forward?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I suppose like the origin story of this work is at some point, Arvind and I were writing about the fallacies that people often commit when they're talking about AGI and existential risks. And, we were sort of researching this topic. We wrote a couple of essays on this. And at some point, we realized that what we are actually concerned with, what the key point of disagreement is between our worldviews and like the folks who think we'll soon have AGI, isn't just about like the possibility of extinction. In fact, like people who have dystopian worldviews about the coming apocalypse often have strikingly similar views about the technology as the folks who have these utopian worldviews. Both sort of camps, if you want to call them that, think about AI as this technology that will soon become super intelligent. From the dystopian worldview, this will lead to catastrophic and existential risks. From the utopian worldview, AI will soon cure cancer. It'll cure basically all diseases. It'll basically cause the end of labor, the end of human suffering, and so on. But both of these views fall under this broader, larger worldview that AI will soon become super intelligent. And I think this was what we recognized as like one key disagreement with this camp, is that we don't actually think AI will become super intelligent. In fact, in this worldview, super intelligence as it is usually defined is kind of incoherent. And that's because like the AI community sort of conflates different concepts under the sort of broader umbrella term of intelligence. And I think in some sense, this normal technology worldview is also in contrast to a lot of academic discourse, especially, that says that, most AI is basically just a passing fad. Much of the hype around AI is unwarranted, and that we will probably never have AI systems that lead to marked changes in how the world operates. And I think AI as normal technology is sort of a third alternative, if you will. It is rejecting both the fact that AI might one day be super intelligent and the fact that AI is like a passing fad, that we'll never get anything productive out of this. And, by the term normal technology, we simply mean the past waves of general purpose technologies, of which we've seen many iterations of so far. So in the late 19th century, we saw electricity. In the late 20th century, we saw the internet. We've also seen computing. All of these are general purpose technologies that we would call normal technologies in our worldview. They did indeed change the world, but this transformation was not overnight. This happened over a period of decades. And this was even when the initial technology was well developed. We had electric dynamos back in the 1870s, and yet it took until the 1920s for factories to catch up, for us to electrify these factories. And we think something similar might happen with AI. It'll follow the trends that these past general purpose technologies have. It'll be adopted through the economy slowly through this gradual process of diffusion. When people experiment with new technology, they adapt their processes, they train the workforce, they figure out what the productive use cases are. And this inevitably is bottlenecked by social processes, not by technological processes, which are inherently much slower. And so we expect these changes to occur over the next 10, 20, 30 years, when gradually cognitive tasks would be automated. So this is in contrast to the superintelligence worldview. And it's in contrast to this worldview of AI as a passing fad, because we do think that at least in the next few decades, we expect most knowledge work, most jobs where people think for a living, to be transformed by AI. This might sound like a very radical claim, but if you think about it, 40 years ago, saying that most knowledge work would one day be mediated by the internet would have sounded similarly radical. And yet that's where we are today. In some sense, the internet has changed the world. In another sense, it has not been a very dramatic shift. Most things are the same. The GDP did not suddenly spike up and so on. And we expect something similar will happen with AI.
I think that thinking of AI the way that you think of electricity is definitely a novel approach at this. And it's a very interesting one. And I want to get back to that question in a bit. But before we deep dive a little bit more into what it really means to consider it normal technology and what the implications of that would look like, I do want to push back a little bit, because I think just especially over the last couple of weeks and months, there's been a lot of very ambitious visions that have been coming from a lot of authors and a lot of institutions. So what I'm talking about obviously is AI 2027, and it envisions a future where there's an artificial general intelligence, and it either ends up dominating or exterminating the human race by 2030. It's been making its rounds. I've also taken a look at it. It has a very nice sort of like layout and like the timeline of how that happens. It's a very interactive piece of work. And there are, in fact, quite a lot of citations and a lot of like work that's gone into backing that up. Your view on this is a lot more skeptical on the achievement of artificial general intelligence, from what I can gather. What is your core disagreement? with this view? I imagine you've gotten this question a lot because I know these two views have been pitted against each other a lot. And would you call yourself a tech optimist in this case?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So I think there are two core disagreements. And like AI 2027 is written by people that both Arvind and I know and have talked to, and we've sort of had the opportunity to hash this out in person as well. And I think my takeaway is that there are two assumptions, or there are two sort of like key differences that underlie these different worldviews. The first is technical, and the second is social. The technical disagreement is that AI systems would soon be good enough to do all sorts of like tasks, would have like a similar capacity for thinking and reasoning and carrying out tasks in the real world as humans do, or perhaps would supersede humans very quickly. As we see it right now, I don't think we are on track. There are all of these different cognitive capabilities that humans have, like learning on the fly from like a small number of data points, or being able to continuously sort of adapt the learning process as we go on over time, or be able to carry out tasks in an embodied way. And we might address all of these challenges one at a time. In some cases, it might turn out to be much harder than we expect right now. There are bottlenecks that have continuously sort of arisen in the history of AI technology that were not foreseen by the AI developers. In fact, I think Marvin Minsky back in the 1960s famously said that solving computer vision is something that a few undergrads could do over the course of a summer. And of course, it famously took the next 50 years for us to make some decent progress on that problem. And so I think these are all challenges that are currently unsolved. They are beyond our capacity to predict because they require scientific breakthroughs. We don't have like a clear path to when and how we might be able to conduct the research and to what the research gaps might be. So that's like a technical aspect of the disagreement. We just don't think we're on track to get this type of rapid technical improvement that would lead us all the way to AI systems that are like much better across the board compared to how humans think and act. The other disagreement is about not the AI systems themselves, but about all of the environment and, broadly speaking, how we integrate AI into society. I think it is often assumed within the AI safety community, which is the community from where AI 2027 and other pieces emerge, that as soon as we develop AI systems that are extremely capable, that by default, they'll also become extremely powerful. And, this nexus of capability and power is sort of what this community calls intelligence. But I think this is sort of an ill-defined term because, we can have systems that are extremely capable without giving them the power to sort of do critical tasks in the real world. And in fact, we think this is what will by default happen, that we will continue to improve the capabilities of these systems, but we'll still maintain power, we'll still maintain control over how these systems are deployed in the real world. I think a strawman example of this is, we today have systems that could plausibly control the nuclear arsenal. You could like hook up the nuclear arsenal to a ChatGPT-like system and allow it to make decisions about when and whether to deploy these. And that would be catastrophic, right? And so, we do have the capability in some sense to hand over these important decisions to AI. But we don't do that simply because we realize that the consequence of that would be losing control over these important real world systems. And I think on a smaller scale, the same thing will continue to play out. Like even if we have systems of a similar capability, systems that can in theory do a job, it'll take a lot of time for us to be comfortable to test out the limits of these systems to ensure that we can retain control. Perhaps a more clear example is that of self-driving cars, where technically we've had the capability of deploying these cars on the road for them to sort of drive around or take turns or whatever for the last decade or two. But it is only in the last few years that we've become good enough at controlling these systems, at maintaining that control, that we started to roll them out. And even so, we do it one city at a time in very small pilots. We take a year of time before we sort of deploy them into a city. And so I think that is the approach that we'll see for like most critical applications of AI.
So this is such an interesting space because on the one hand, you have said that AI is overhyped and it can't really do everything that people say it does. And maybe that puts you in a more of a pessimist category, but also you're saying that it's not going to take over the world, and that puts you in a more optimist category. And I guess much like your work, you're somewhere in the center of that line. So that's an interesting, I think, place to be. You've talked a little bit, I think, now about the safety and security concerns around AI. Since we work a lot on policy surrounding the use of AI and the deployment of AI, this is something that we've also been tracking quite closely. Specifically, I think because uh, India is also looking to position itself as a global AI hub. So it's also grappling with a lot of these questions around regulation and investment and talent and development. So there's a lot of conversations happening right now about what is AI's genuine potential, and then how do you see what to invest in. You don't want to end up investing in an overhyped technology. So how do you craft policies based around AI's actual capabilities and not just its speculative future? So in this particular context, what do you think are the questions or uncertainties about AI's future that you think deserve more attention, more from a policy perspective? Like, not just in terms of, oh, if you put this, you're going to get massive growth, or if you use this, yes, it will lead to sort of like a super intelligence development. What are like the real questions about AI's future that you think policymakers especially should be looking at?
One of the key themes of AI as normal technology is that the real impacts of AI are only realized once the technology is broadly diffused across society. And, unlike the superintelligence view where the tech is enough to sort of ensure broad diffusion, I think in the normal tech worldview, there are many sort of hurdles to diffusion that act as bottlenecks for AI progress, that act as impediments for being able to productively diffuse this technology across society. And so I think this is what my worldview is informed by. And I think one of the key things that governments can do right now is to invest in the sort of measures that would allow this productive diffusion to take place, as well as that would allow us to sort of be resilient to many of the risks that we think AI might have. So in the first category, in sort of promoting diffusion, I think this basically involves investing in the complements of automation. So, we might have like technology that allows us to automate many tasks. I think we're on track for that. Even if we don't see major advances in the state of advanced AI, we still have this general purpose technology that can be used across different sectors of the economy. But it requires these somewhat structural changes. For example, it requires a workforce that can actively use AI. It requires figuring out what use cases different industries might be able to adopt. It requires a lot of training, perhaps even literacy in how to use AI. Like just like we have basic computer education, I think we might want to invest in children being able to learn how to productively engage with AI, how to avoid addiction, and so on. And so I think all of that is, I think in my view, like a good investment from a policy standpoint, because it's helpful regardless of the pace of the technology advancing. There is, as you can tell, a lot of uncertainty about how the tech will advance. So it makes sense to invest in things that are helpful independent of what the rate of these advances would be. When it comes to the risks, I think I have a similar view where, if we focus on making society more resilient to the harms of AI, the potential harms, as well as what we've already seen so far, I think that would be far more important than sort of trying to control the pace of AI itself. One example of this is more equitable labor markets that might allow people the flexibility, even if and when there comes a point where they're impacted due to AI or other structural factors in the economy that allows them to sort of get back on their feet more quickly. So that might involve like all sorts of provisions for unemployment insurance or things like that. And when it comes to like the more catastrophic risks, so for example, we've seen evidence that AI systems are really good at writing code, and that also means that they can be like pretty effective for cybersecurity, offensive cybersecurity applications, right? Like you can have AI systems that can automatically find bugs in critical pieces of infrastructure and so on. And that has led to a lot of concern about, how we can continue to defend critical cyber infrastructure. But there too, I think the correct response isn't to clamp down on the technology because, malicious users will always have ways of accessing technology and you can't really defend against all of them. unless if you invest in AI systems to improve your cyber defense, because the same tech that can find these bugs can also help fix them. And I think we need a lot more investment in using AI for cyber defense. And I think the similar story unfolds in many other domains where we can invest in making society more resilient as opposed to clamping down or trying to hope for slowdowns in the pace of technical progress, because they are effective independently of how quickly the tech advances and what changes take place there.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. I do think that there's going to be, you need to put a lot more investment, not just in terms of money, but also in terms of capacity, in terms of education, into the infrastructure surrounding AI use and AI deployment in the country as we look to put these technologies into the real world, especially through public welfare systems. And I think that to a large extent, AI deployment also requires people to maybe recalibrate their expectations about what they think AI is going to do over the next decade. So I think this is just like a more of a hypothetical question to you. How should the public and the policymakers, even the technologists, recalibrate their expectations on what AI is going to do? Because we don't want another sort of repeat of the we don't need any more radiologists and then we have a shortage 6 years later.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. It's also a hard question to answer, but let me try to give it a shot. So I think so far we've tended to rely on the benchmark performance of AI systems to estimate how well AI might be able to do. And unfortunately, the AI community's focus on benchmark evaluations has sort of bled into discussions of its real world impact. So, for example, when OpenAI published their GPT-4 technical report, they said that the model performed in the top 10 percentile of bar exam test takers in the US. And, that's great. And it's good that we have systems that can answer legal questions correctly. But at the same time, it also isn't true that a lawyer's job is to answer bar exam questions all day. Right. And so when people reported on this technical report, many people said that, this basically means that AI is coming for lawyers, that we'll soon have no need for them, that AI will automate away these basic tasks. And I think that is a key misunderstanding to avoid, that benchmark accuracy should not be used to inform real world decisions. I think there's a lot more that goes into a job than just focusing on benchmark evaluations. And so I think there are better metrics that governments and technologists can track in order to understand the societal impact of AI, not just the impact of technology. These include things like uplift studies. So, giving a subset of professionals access to a tool and then looking at how well they go on to do at their jobs compared to those without access. This might include surveys. And at the broadest level, I think we need to figure out what the right macroeconomic indicators are to track AI progress and how it's impacting the economy. So one sort of fundamental change is a shift in the metrics that we use to identify progress. Another one is something I mentioned before, which is I do think we should stop giving so much credence to AI experts when it comes to understanding the real world impact of AI and start relying much more on domain experts. Because domain experts actually know what goes into doing a particular job. They can understand what the impacts of AI are, where the capabilities are today. And I think at the very least, I think we need more collaborations between domain experts and AI experts and figuring out what the real impact of AI would be on any given profession.
I think it's great to hear somebody who is one of Time's 100 most influential people in AI and an AI expert talk to us about sharing space for other experts and bringing in more domain expertise when you look at AI and what it's capable of and how you should govern it. Before we wrap up, I have a few quick bonus questions, and I'd really like to get maybe just like quick 30-second to a minute answers. Just wanted to get your take on these. What is the most overhyped claim about AI that you've heard this year?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. So I think a few months ago, there was this study that came out of the MIT economics department that sort of claimed that AI had this really interesting effect on professionals in, if I remember correctly, the medical industry, where, most studies in the past had shown that AI disproportionately benefits the lower percentile workers, but this one showed that experts actually benefit a lot more from AI. It was a really large study, really nicely done. All of the results seemed plausible. And I think a few people at the time raised some concerns about the potential authenticity of the study, which were, this was like a single author doing this massive study. It turned out that the study actually might have begun before ChatGPT was even introduced. So they might have required a lot of foresight into like the potential technical like advancements and so on. And a couple of weeks ago, I actually found out that the study was retracted eventually, that there was no such study performed. And that really was a reminder of how easy it is to sort of over-rely on any individual source to understand the impact of AI. This was like a paper that basically, as far as I can tell, was completely made up. There was no such study done in the first place. And yet it came out of MIT, the economics department. So I think it's just a reminder for us all to be a bit more skeptical about any given piece of work.
What is your favorite AI snake oil myth that you came across while you were doing research for the book that you wish would just disappear?
I think the favorite one has to be that, or the one that I'm most peeved about has to be that AI can predict the future. I think this just seems like such an obvious thing to rebut. Of course we can't predict the future, especially when it comes to individual people. It seems like the most common sense thing in the world. And yet when it comes to AI, I think we seem to have given up on common sense. So I would like to go back to sort of a world where people recognize that irrespective of how great the technology is, irrespective of what advances we have made, some things are just really hard to do. They're just sort of impossible to do, especially at an individual level. And so I hope, or I wish that people would sort of understand that, predicting the future is inherently hard, independent of how good your AI is.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that people think that using AI to predict who's going to be your best employee is something that will conclusively work out when I don't think we haven't managed to do it with HR being around for so long. So I've also wondered about what the thought process behind that is. And then finally, if assuming the superintelligence theory is right and AI really does take over the world before 2030, what do you think is the first thing you would do?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, of course, I'm speculating, but I would have to say that I think the AI systems would be horrified by the dismal state of cybersecurity that we have today, and it would quickly proceed to fix all of the cybersecurity bugs in every single piece of infrastructure. At least that's my hope.
Well, okay, that's a pretty good answer. I'd say a very optimistic one. Sayash, this has been a truly enlightening conversation. I think you've provided our listeners with a much needed reality check on AI capabilities while also highlighting the real challenges and opportunities that exist today. Your work on cutting through the hype while focusing on tangible present-day AI impacts is incredibly valuable for policymakers, technologists, and the public alike. Thank you so much for sharing your time and insights with us today.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure to be here.
To our listeners, we'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. To make sure you don't miss it, please be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast from. To learn more about the research and team, you can visit us on our website at carnegieindia.org. You can also find us on social media on X, Facebook, Blue Sky, and Instagram. Thank you for listening. See you next time.